Have you ever wondered how far cruelty could go in ancient Egypt? While the pyramids rose majestically and the pharaohs ruled with absolute power, in the shadows, torture so atrocious were carried out that they were forbidden to be told, hidden for centuries in the deepest temples and tombs of the desert. Today, in this video, I will reveal the darkest and most terrifying practices that even the scribes dared not record on papyri. Some of these tortures are so extreme that they will forever change the way you see ancient Egypt. Warning, the last punishment we'll see is considered by many to be the most inhumane and terrifying torture in all of Egyptian history. So stay until the end. You won't want to miss it. Before we begin, what do you think was the most horrifying torture of antiquity? Write your answer in the comments right now and see if you guess correctly by the end of the video. And if you're passionate about the darkest and most forbidden historical tales, subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any of them. The punishment of 1,000 cuts with copper knives, the torture that slowly bled victims to death in ancient Egypt. Imagine being completely immobilized under the relentless Egyptian desert sun, while an executioner, armed with rudimentary yet sharp copper knife, begins to carry out the cruelest of punishments, the 1,000 cuts. This method of torture, as brutal as it was meticulous, involved making small superficial cuts, one after another, on different parts of the victim's body. On the arms, legs, torso, even the face, all while the person remained fully conscious, feeling every tear of their skin and every drop of blood slowly sliding over their flesh. Scorched by the heat, the copper knife, though not as sharp as modern metals, was perfect for prolonging the suffering. It didn't slice cleanly, but tore through the flesh, making each wound even more painful and difficult to heal. The goal wasn't a quick death, but slow agony, a macabre dance in which the victim gradually bled out, losing strength with each cut as the executioner meticulously counted up to 1,000. This type of torture was reserved for the most despised traitors, enemies of the pharaoh, or those who dared to profane the sacred temples. It wasn't enough to kill them. Their punishment had to serve as a horrifying example to anyone who considered defying the order imposed by the gods and their representatives on earth. But there is something even more chilling. According to some hidden texts from the crypts of Saqqara, it is said that victims, before receiving the first cuts, were forced to gaze upon the knives drenched in the blood of sacrificed animals, a macabre warning of what awaited them. And as the executioner continued his task, priests would chant funerary hymns, not a guide to condemned soul, but to seal it, preventing it from resting in the afterlife, condemning it to wander eternally among the living. Can you imagine anything more terrifying? Let us know in the comments. Do you think this punishment is the cruelest of all, or do you know of an even worse one? And remember, don't leave yet, because at the end of the video we will reveal an even more horrifying torture, the most forbidden of all ancient Egypt. Dismemberment in the temple, the public severing of limbs as a warning in ancient Egypt. Among the most horrendous and symbolic punishments of ancient Egypt stands out of practice, as brutal as it was meticulously calculated. Public dismemberment in the sacred temples. This form of execution was not simply a way to physically eliminate an enemy or traitor, but a ritualized act of terror, designed to send a clear and inescapable message to all of society. Betrayal against the pharaoh or the gods was paid with fate worse than death. The condemned was brought to the center of the plaza or temple courtyard, often at Karnak, Luxor, or the temples of Thebes, places of deep religious reverence. There, before priests, soldiers, and a terrified crowd of citizens, the sentence was carried out. First, the victim was stripped of all clothing, not just for humiliation, but to show that not even their earthly identity could protect them from divine justice. Then, their limbs, arms, legs, and sometimes even genitals were amputated slowly and meticulously using flint or copper blades, which, though rudimentary, were sufficient to fulfill the macabre ritual. This act did not seek an immediate death, but instead prolonged the victim's suffering as much as possible. The executioners, trained in this form of punishment, knew how to cut without affecting vital organs, allowing the bleeding to be slow and painful, while the spectators watched in a deathly silence, broken only by the condemned's harrowing screams. But the most terrifying part was what happened afterward. The severed limbs were arranged on the ground in ritual patterns, often forming symbols associated with dishonor or betrayal. In some cases, The remains were hung at the entrances of the temple or on nearby obelisks, so that every visitor or devotee coming to pay homage to the gods would be reminded of what happened to those who defied the pharaoh or desecrated sacred places. It is said that some of these acts were witnessed by entire generations, imprinting on a collective memory a reverential fear toward the religious and political norms of ancient Egypt. And the most disturbing part, the souls of the dismembered could not access the afterlife. According to Egyptian beliefs, in order to achieve eternal life, the body had to remain whole. Thus, this punishment not only destroyed the body, but also condemned the spirit to wander eternally, unable to be reborn or to find peace alongside Osiris. Can you imagine a punishment more terrible than the destruction, not only of life, but of eternity itself? Leave your opinion in the comments. Do you think this punishment is more brutal than the 1,000 cuts? Which of the two do you find more inhumane? Don't go yet, because there are still more dark and atrocious stories to uncover. And remember, at the end of this video, we will reveal the most forbidden and horrifying torture of all ancient Egypt, the living tomb imprisonment, the silent and eternal punishment in ancient Egypt. Of all the forms of torture and execution practiced in ancient Egypt, perhaps none is as chilling and symbolic as imprisonment within a living tomb. Unlike other punishments that sought to inflict immediate and visible physical pain, this sentence aimed at something far more perverse, a slow, silent, and completely isolated death as the condemned face the darkness and their inevitable end, surrounded by the eternal stones of a pyramid or funerary mastaba. This punishment was reserved for the most severe traitors, tomb desecrators, a crime unforgivable in the Egyptian worldview, or those who violated the most sacred religious laws. The sentence consisted of being taken to a tomb, often under construction or unfinished, deeply hidden within the subterranean labyrinths of a pyramid or necropolis, and they're sealed alive, with no possibility of escape, nor anyone to hear their desperate screams. The condemned was placed in the burial chamber, alone without food or water, with barely an oil lamp lit that would slowly extinguish, leaving the victim in absolute darkness. Priests and laborers would close the entrance of the chamber with large stone blocks, sealing it with mortar and performing protective rituals, not for condemned, but to prevent their spirit from escaping and seeking revenge. Imagine those final moments, surrounded by cold, hermetic walls, hearing the echo of their own screams as the air thins and the lamp flickers until it finally goes out. The mind of the condemned, trapped in an endless cycle of terror and despair, becomes their own executioner, as the body slowly succumbs to hunger, thirst, and suffocation. But the most terrifying part comes after. According to Egyptian beliefs, those who died in an impure or cursed manner were trapped in the Duat, the Egyptian underworld, unable to complete the journey to the judgment of Osiris or attain immortality. Thus, imprisonment in a living tomb meant not only the death of the body, but also the eternal condemnation of the soul, a double punishment that made this method one of the most cruel and inhumane penalties in all of Egyptian history. There are legends claiming that deep within some pyramids, sealed chambers still remain unopened, where the mummified remains of these condemned individuals rest in the very position in which they drew their last breath, trapped between this world and the next. Can you imagine dying like that, buried alive, with no one to hear your pleas, with no one to mourn for you? Leave your comment. What's worse, a quick, brutal death or slow, lonely one like this? Death by scorpion stings, the poisonous and silent punishment of ancient Egypt. Among the most terrifying and ruthless tortures practiced in ancient Egypt, one stands out for its lethal simplicity and deep connection with nature: death by scorpion stings. This punishment, as silent as it was effective, was a sentence reserved for the most abominable crimes, such as tomb desecration, direct treason against the pharaoh, or blasphemy against the gods. Imagine for a moment this scene: a condemned man bound hand and foot, placed in a small stone cell under the scorching heat of the desert. In front of him, a wicker basket shakes frenetically. Inside, dozens of venomous scorpions, deliberately captured from the most inhospitable and deadly corners of the Nile, anxious to defend themselves from the threat they perceive. Priests or executioners, dressed in ceremonial robes, will begin to chant prayers or curses, invoking Serket, the scorpion goddess, known for protecting against stings, but also for punishing with them those who disobey divine laws. Slowly and ritualistically, The basket would be overturned onto the prisoner's naked body. The scorpions, maddened by confinement and heat, would desperately seek an escape and, upon finding human flesh, attack mercilessly. The first stings caused sharp pain, as if thousands of poison needles pierced the skin. But the worst was yet to come. The toxins of Egyptian scorpions, especially the Androctonus australis, known as the man-killer, provoked violent muscle spasms, progressive paralysis, and a burning pain from within, as if hell itself had taken hold of every nerve. The victim would writhe, scream in agony, until, finally, the respiratory muscles became paralyzed, leading to a slow, agonizing, and absolutely terrifying death. This punishment not only inflicted physical suffering, but also sent a symbolic message. Nature, created and controlled by the gods, was the ultimate instrument of Egyptian justice. They didn't need swords or spears. It was enough to unleash venomous creatures to carry out the sentence. But the most disturbing part is that, according to hidden texts from the Temple of Edfu, some condemned individuals did not die immediately. The resilience of certain bodies and the variability of toxins meant that the agony could extend for hours or even days until death finally claimed them, leaving their bodies twisted in unnatural positions as a warning to all who dare defy the pharaoh or disturb the cosmic order known as Ma'at. Can you imagine the terror of feeling multiple stings, knowing there is no escape, that your body is condemned to an imminent but slow death in complete solitude? Leave us your comment. Do you think this form of execution is more cruel than the previous ones? Or do you believe there are even worse punishments? Don't go anywhere. There's still more dark and chilling stories to uncover. And remember, at the end of this video, we will reveal the most forbidden and horrifying torture of all ancient Egypt. The fire of Ra, punishments with flames and burning oils. The embodied wrath of the god of ancient Egypt. When we talk about the most cruel and terrifying tortures of ancient Egypt, it is impossible not to mention one of the most symbolic and ruthless forms of punishment, the fire of Ra. This was not simply a method of execution, but a ritual laden with mysticism, fear, and divine power. The flames did not just destroy the body, they also purified the condemned soul, or, according to the darkest priests, condemned it to burn eternally. In the Egyptian worldview, fire was directly associated with Ra, the sun god, the creator of all existence, but also the bearer of uncontrollable fury. According to ancient funerary texts, when Ra became enraged with humanity, he sent Sekhmet, the lioness goddess, to ravage with fire those who broke the balance of Ma'at, the cosmic order. Inspired by this theology, priests and executioners replicated that divine punishment on earth through the dreaded ritual of flames and burning oils. Imagine the scene: a condemned person, accused of treason against the pharaoh, desecrating a temple, or conspiring against the clergy, is brought to the execution courtyard under the relentless desert sun. There, among blazing torches and ritual chants, stand the symbol of Ra, a great solar disk painted red and gold, before which the prisoner kneels, knowing that their final moments will be hellish. The punishment began with the application of highly flammable oils and resins, extracted from Nile plants and mixed with animal fats. These ointments not only intensified the pain, but ensured that the combustion would be slow, prolonged, and absolutely merciless. Next, the condemned was tied to a wooden post or placed in a metal cage while priests recited invocations to Ra, asking him to accept the sacrifice and purify the evil that contaminated the world. The fire was first lit at the feet, allowing the flames to slowly ascend the body as the skin blistered, split into bleeding sores, and the flesh began to peel away under the unbearable heat. The victim screamed in desperation that echoed across the valley, but the onlookers showed no compassion. This was a manifestation of divine justice, and so it had to be. In some hidden accounts, preserved in papyri rarely displayed to the public, it is said that sometimes the oil was poured directly over the condemned's head and set alight, causing instant combustion and an almost immediate death. Although the executioners usually avoided this quick method, always opting to prolong the agony so that it served as an example and warning. But the most disturbing part was the symbolic meaning. To burn in the fire of Ra meant to be consumed by the god's wrath, with no possibility of redemption in the afterlife. The soul of one who suffered this punishment was believed to be destined to wander eternally through the Duat, the Egyptian underworld, unable to complete their judgment before Osiris. The charred body became unrecognizable, incapable of being mummified, which meant condemnation to an eternal death beyond the physical. Can you imagine the terror of knowing that more than just losing your life, you would lose any possibility of attaining eternity? Leave your comment. Do you think this punishment by fire is worse than flaying or scorpion stings? Which of these tortures do you think is the most atrocious? We want to read your opinion. And remember, don't go anywhere, because at the end of this video we will reveal the most forbidden and horrifying torture ever practiced in ancient Egypt. A punishment so inhuman that not even the official texts dare to describe it in full. The scarab of agony, torture with sacred insects in ancient Egypt. A slow, horrible, and spiritually devastating death. When we think of ancient Egypt, we automatically visualize majestic pyramids, golden sarcophagi, and sacred rituals. But behind that splendor also hid methods of punishment as ingenious as they were macabre. One of the most disturbing and lesser known was the use of a symbol revered throughout Egyptian culture, the scarab or khepri. However, we are not talking here about the protective amulet or the divine figure representing rebirth, but about one of the most cruel and repugnant tortures ever conceived: torture with live scarabs. The dung beetle was, for the Egyptians, an embodiment of creation, of the eternal cycle of life. But in a twisted turn of that symbolism, certain priests and executioners transformed the sacred insect into an instrument of punishment, a tool of agony that degraded both the body and the spirit of the victim. How did this torture work? The condemned, usually a tomb robber or someone accused of offending the gods, was tied naked in a vulnerable position, typically on their back with arms and legs extended. Next, superficial incisions were made in the skin, or fresh wounds were left open, caused by whips or blades. On these lacerated areas, dozens of live scarabs were placed, large beetles with strong mandibles and scavenging habits, trapped inside small clay containers or baskets tied to the body. The desperation began immediately. The insects, hungry and trapped, desperately sought a way out, and the only escape was through the living flesh. They began to bite, to tear at the skin, to slowly penetrate the soft tissues, while the victim, fully conscious, suffered an indescribable pain, an agony that could last for hours or even days. But the torment was not only physical. In the Egyptian worldview, being devoured by a sacred animal in an unnatural way was considered a spiritual curse. The victim not only lost their body, but also the right to a proper burial, to the embalming process, and therefore to eternal life. It was a total punishment, carnal, psychological, and spiritual. The executioner could intensify the torture by covering the prisoner with a mixture of honey, sugary resins, and animal excrement, attracting not only scarabs, but also other insects, red ants, scorpions, and even flesh-eating larvae. The victim literally became a living feast, while the priests watched him passively, reciting ritual formulas of condemnation. This method of torture was so horrific that it was rarely applied, reserved only for those who committed crimes considered direct affronts to the divine, such as the destruction of statues of the gods, public blasphemy, or the murder of a priest. Can you imagine the terror? Not only feeling the excruciating physical pain, but knowing that your soul would be consumed by the contempt of the gods, that you would not be welcomed into the Duat, the underworld, nor judged by Osiris. Only condemnation, oblivion, and suffering. Leave us your comment. Do you think this torture surpasses in horror the flaying or the fire of RA? Which of all these techniques do you think is the cruelest and most ruthless in history? Write your opinion. We want to read it. And don't go away, because in the next and final segment, we will reveal the most forbidden, the most horrifying, and the most secret torture of ancient Egypt. A method so brutal that it was erased from the official records, so as not to stain the image of the civilization that built the pyramids. The torture of flaying, the most painful and humiliating punishment of ancient Egypt. To conclude this dark journey through the most forbidden tortures of ancient Egypt, we must face one of the most atrocious and terrifying forms of punishment ever conceived by humanity. Among all the methods of torture and execution known in ancient civilizations, few equal the brutality and psychological horror of the torture of flaying, being stripped of one's skin while still alive. In ancient Egypt, this practice was applied exceptionally, reserved for those who committed the most unforgivable crimes. Enemy spies, traitors to the divine authority of the pharaoh, and especially tomb desecrators, an act that, in the Egyptian mindset, represented a direct assault on the eternity of the dead and therefore an outrage against the entire cosmos. The skin, for the Egyptians, was not merely a protective organ, but also a spiritual symbol. It was considered the outer layer that connected the body with the Ka, the vital force, and the Ba, the soul capable of flight. Stripping someone of their skin was equivalent to severing their connection with both the world of the living and the dead, condemning them to an existence of physical and spiritual torment. The process of flaying began with the prisoner tightly bound to a bench or column, usually in a public square or outside a temple, so that their suffering could serve as a visual warning to the entire community. The executioners, using finely sharpened obsidian or copper blades, would start the incision in areas where the skin is most sensitive, behind the ears, under the arms, and the groin. The objective was not to cause immediate death, but to keep the condemned conscious while large sections of skin were torn away, exposing muscles and nerves to the open air. The victim's piercing screams mingled with the sepulchral silence of spectators, who watched horrified yet fascinated by the macabre spectacle. The pain was unimaginable. The skin, one of the body's most sensitive organs, when torn off, provoked absolute agony, a burning that not even death could immediately relieve. Often, to prolong the torture, executioners would immerse the flayed body in salt or vinegar, intensifying the burning sensation and accelerating the dehydration of the exposed tissues. Only after ensuring that the victim had suffered to the absolute limit of human endurance was death permitted, whether by hypovolemic shock, infection, or simply massive blood loss. But the horror did not end there. In some cases, the removed skin was hung at the entrance of the city or the desecrated temple as an explicit warning. Thus shall perish anyone who dares to defy the pharaoh or disturb the peace of the dead. This practice, documented in ancient reliefs and punitive texts, sought not only to punish the offender, but also to preserve the balance of Ma'at, the cosmic and social order. The most chilling aspect is that the priests justified this brutality as an act of divine justice. The condemned not only paid with their body, but were also condemned in the afterlife, for a disfigured body could not be properly embalmed, thus preventing the soul from completing its journey to the judgment of Osiris and attaining immortality. Can you imagine the terror of facing such a death, knowing that not only would you lose your life, but also your eternity? And now, as we finish this dark journey, I ask you, could you endure the terror and pain of being flayed alive? What do you think of a civilization that combined the wisdom of the pharaohs with such cruel and ruthless punishments? Leave your comment with your most honest opinion. Which of these tortures horrified you the most? Do you think ancient Egypt still hides even darker secrets that were never told? Don't forget that if you were fascinated by this journey, you should subscribe and activate the notification bell, so you don't miss our upcoming dark stories that unveil the deepest shadows of history. This is just the beginning of what the sands of time hold, because real history is never just what they tell us.